right, in this video, we are looking at the 7900 XT from AMD. I have the Power Color Hellhound Edition running at its out-of-the-box settings, and it's up against the new 4070 Ti Super from NVIDIA. I have the Asus TUF gaming model. The big difference here versus our 4070 Ti non-Super is that we have 16 gigabytes of VRAM and some more memory bandwidth, which I'm curious because a lot of people, their main issue with the original 4070 Ti versus 7900 XT was VRAM. 7900 XT still has more VRAM at 20, but it seems like less of a big deal, 16 versus 20 than 12 versus 20, right? Also, pricing has been changing on the market. The 7900 XT has been it was a $900 MSRP card, which was just stupid, as pointed out in original reviews. However, it has since slipped quite a bit, and with the new Super series coming in, we have seen prices as low as $710. As of today, the day of release and filming this video, I am seeing prices as low as $720, and then going up from there, $725, $730, and the kind of rumor mill is pointing to AMD somewhat targeting about a $750 price, which is the price of the Power Color Hellhound that I'm reviewing in this video. So I'll give a lot of thoughts at the end on what do I think about all that. Let's run the benchmarks to get an idea of what our performance situation looks like. Oh, and one last thing, please actually read the important note at the beginning of the benchmark run. Some people talk about which one looks smoother in the video footage. You shouldn't be looking at that, you should be looking at the frame time graphs. Frame rate numbers being produced out of sync with 60 FPS capture can introduce judder and screen tearing and things like that, which would not be visible on a variable refresh rate display in person. So again, you should be looking at things like 1% lows and frame time graphs to judge the smoothness of the gameplay, not the visual appearance of the footage. Let's roll the benchmarks. All right, we're gonna start out with Alan Wake 2. We'll start out without the heavy ray tracing stuff. We'll just be at the high no ray tracing preset. Notice that this game doesn't have a TAA pathway. It just has DLSS or FSR, but you can run them at the native full resolution, which is what we're doing here. Slight image quality differences. I do think the FSR looks a little more sparkly at times, but anyway, still looks good on both sides, and the 7900 XT is taking a 6% lead, although the 70 Ti is taking a 7% lead in the 1% lows. So I'd call that about a tie. I'd still call it about a tie at 1440p resolution. Again, high settings. There is no ultra preset in this game. High is the highest non-ray traced preset, although some individual settings could be turned higher. Here we're seeing 7900 XT take a 1 FPS lead in the averages, but the 4070 Ti taking a 2% lead in the 1% lows. There's really not a lot in the differences here, and they're both performing very well. Honestly, they were performing well enough that you might not want to upscale at 1440p, but I thought I'd test it out anyway just to see what we would get, and image quality differences. I do think the DLSS image quality is a bit less sparkly, especially as things are uncovered by the character's motion. Performance-wise, though, now the 7900 XT does take a 9% lead at 114 versus 105, although the 1% lows are an advantage for the 4070 Ti Super, just by 3 FPS, which is 5% at these numbers. If we go up to 4K resolution at high settings, no upscaling, both GPUs are playable, and this is a pretty slow-paced game. The averages are pretty close, a 5% lead for the 4070 Ti Super, but the frame time graph for the 7900 XT is incredibly spiky, causing its 1% lows to dip, and so you're getting a much smoother experience for the 4070 Ti Super with a 63% lead in the 1% lows. Now, what if we kick on upscaling? Now performance numbers I think are where people would actually want to be here. We're over 60 FPS on both GPUs. It's only a 2 FPS difference at 70 versus 68, 3% lead for the 7900 XT, except for those 1% lows again. They're still spiky on the 7900 XT side. I'm curious if this is an FSR difference or just a difference between the GPU brands. But anyway, it's a 41% lead in the 1% lows for the 4070 Ti Super. But this is one of the big path tracing games. So let's kick that on with the RT High preset at 1080p native. The 4070 Ti Super is hardly doing amazing with 54 FPS, but it's certainly very, very playable at native 1080p here. And the 7900 XT is only averaging 24, so we're more than doubling the performance in this heavy path tracing workload, and the 1% lows are even more rough at 42 versus 16. If we do kick on quality level upscaling, the 7900 XT is now playable in this style of a game. However, at lower resolutions, I do think the DLSS image quality advantage is a bit more noticeable. Also, the 4070 Ti Super does take a 78 FPS number versus 41, which is a 90% lead in the averages, and more than doubling the 1% lows at 60 versus 28. The game does also feature DLSS 3 frame generation if you want to kick that on. Note that all my numbers when I'm doing the percentage differences are without frame generation factored in. I'm just showing those results in the middle. Keep in mind that those do take a latency penalty. Also, I didn't love how it looked in this game with the flashlight beam. But anyway, at 1440p with path tracing enabled, with quality level upscaling, the 4070 Ti is very playable at 58, which is also a decent baseline for frame generation if you want to use it, and it's more than doubling the performance of the 7900 XT. If we move up to 4K resolution with the path tracing mode enabled, neither GPU is doing great even with performance mode upscaling. 44 FPS average for the 4070 Ti might be playable in a slow-paced game like this, but I don't think it's ideal. It's also a pretty low base frame rate to try to kick on frame generation, where we can see latency going up to nearly 100 milliseconds, and that's just the internal render latency without peripherals and all that. Let's move on to an AMD-sponsored title now with Avatar: Frontiers of Pandora. At 1080p Ultra, the 4070 Ti Super is taking a 15% lead in the averages and 11% lead in the 1% lows, although both GPUs are doing great. I think you'd be happy with the performance here. But wait, why is NVIDIA leading in an AMD-sponsored title? Well, this, despite being an AMD-sponsored title, does use ray tracing at all graphic presets. So, there is ray tracing factored in here, where NVIDIA does tend to have advantages. Anyway, if we move up to 1440p Ultra, we are seeing a 6% lead for the 4070 Ti Super, so the lead has dropped, although it's still there. I would call this pretty much a tie. The 1% lows are a bit wider gap at 62 versus 57, which is 9% lead for the Super. The average is being 72 and 68, not too much in it. What if you wanted a higher frame rate in a first-person shooter? Well, one option is to kick on quality level upscaling, where the 4070 Ti Super is now taking a 14% lead at 108 versus 95, but both are providing a very good experience here. 10% lead for the 4070 Ti Super and the 1% lows. But there's an image quality difference. If you look at the fencing in the background, the far fencing in the base, you'll see it's a lot more shimmery and flickery on the FSR image quality. If we move, this game is one of the games featuring FSR 3 frame generation. We're looking at it with quality level upscaling plus frame generation. However, I've noticed that it seems to enable VSync on the AMD GPUs, but not the NVIDIA GPUs, which allows me to not really get performance differences here, other than saying that both GPUs could probably lock to a 120 FPS monitor here. There's not a lot I can tell you other than that, because it's VSync locking to my capture card. But anyway, 1440p, what if we drop to high settings instead of upscaling? Well, now we're hitting 99 FPS average on the Ti Super and 88 on the 7900 XT, which is a 13% advantage for the Super, although both GPUs, again, definitely getting a good experience here at 1440p. 81 versus 72 in the 1% lows, which is a 13% advantage for the 4070 Ti Super. And if you really want to chase the higher frame rate experiences, a lot of times going down a preset to high and then kicking on quality level upscaling is a good way to get there. And we're now seeing frame rate numbers jump to 138 on the 4070 Ti Super and 115 on the 7900 XT, giving a 20% advantage now to the 4070 Ti Super and a 19% advantage in the 1% lows at 108 versus 91. Again, there's the image quality advantages for DLSS on like the fencing and fine details as well. What if we move up to 4K resolution? Well, now the performance here is basically a tie. There's a 1 FPS difference at 40 versus 39, advantage 4070 Ti Super, and 36 versus 35 in the 1% lows, again, advantage 4070 Ti Super. So basically, again, it's a tie, it's 4K Ultra, but neither of these frame rates are the settings you'd probably play a first-person shooter at. So if we kick on quality level upscaling, which at 4K resolution looks very good on both FSR and DLSS, although in those fine details I do still see less stability on the FSR image, a little bit more shimmering in the fencing and things like that if you're on a large 4K display. And we're now seeing a 10% performance lead for the 4070 Ti Super as well, although both are doing much better now at 65 versus 59 in the averages and 57 versus 52 in the 1% lows. Another way to boost performance rather than upscaling would be to drop to the high preset. If we do that, we're now seeing performance at 55 versus 50, which is a 10% advantage to the 4070 Ti Super, and a 7% advantage in the 1% lows at 49 versus 46. Now this is certainly playable, and this is a demanding section of the benchmark, so other areas would probably perform even better, but in a first-person shooter, I would personally be chasing even higher frame rates. I prefer to be in the 80 to 90 FPS range. And if we kick on quality level upscaling while remaining at the high preset, we're now seeing 86 versus 73 in the averages, which is an 18% advantage to the 4070 Ti Super. We're probably now approaching the settings I would use to play the game here. In the 1% lows, we're seeing a 15% advantage at 71 versus 62. And again, the small details in the upscaling are advantage DLSS, but at 4K resolution, there's not a lot in it. But let's move on to Cyberpunk. I mainly am interested in looking at the RT Overdrive mode, see how usable that is on the 4070 Ti Super, but with no ray tracing enabled at 1440p Ultra, the 7900 XT is taking a 20% lead at 118 versus 98, and the 1% lows are 22% lead at 90 versus 74. So noticeable win here for the 7900 XT. And that is still a noticeable win at 4K Ultra settings. Again, this is no ray tracing. We're seeing 53 versus 45, giving an 18% advantage to the 7900 XT in the averages, and a 23% advantage in the 1% lows at 43 versus 35. Although in a first-person shooter, I would probably turn down settings here and enable quality level upscaling. But I only have time to run so many tests, and I did want to look at the path tracing mode. So that's what we'll switch to here. So at 1080p RT Overdrive mode, we can see that neither GPU is doing great for a first-person shooter. It's 49 FPS versus 27, but that is a 81% lead for the 4070 Ti Super, and it's certainly arguably playable, even if you probably would be chasing higher frame rates. The 1% lows are 57% advantage to the Super at 36 versus 23. So I think you would, if you were going to use RT Overdrive mode, you would kick on upscaling, which I don't love the look of at 1080p, although I do think ray reconstruction is putting in a lot of work here for DLSS. The image quality is a lot better on this side. Base frame rates now jumping to 86 FPS for the 4070 Ti Super, which is also a good baseline for frame generation, which I'm showing in the middle. Without frame generation, we're seeing a 79% lead at 86 versus 48, although it was at least playable on the 7900 XT. What if we move up to 1440p RT Overdrive mode? Well, you'll definitely want to kick on quality level upscaling at least, and now the 4070 Ti Super hits 59 FPS average without frame generation, and that's about my minimum for wanting to kick on frame gen personally. So you get a pretty good experience here at 1440p with quality level upscaling, and it is 84% faster than the 7900 XT, which is hitting 32 FPS in the averages. And what about 4K path tracing? Well, here I think you're kind of stretching it even for the 4070 Ti Super, where our averages without frame generation are only 47 with performance mode upscaling. That's a 1080p internal resolution. So it's 47 versus 26, so an 81% lead for the 4070 Ti Super, but I don't think you would use these settings. You could kick on frame gen, but I don't like it from this low of a base frame rate. I think you get more interpolation artifacts and latency. Let's move on to one more ray tracing test before we just look at a whole bunch of rasterized tests. Resident Evil 4 Remake is an extremely light ray tracing workload, and here we're seeing a lead for the 4070 Ti Super by 8%, but both GPUs are extremely high frame rates, 168 versus 155, 4% lead in the 1% lows at 140 versus 135. This is also 1080p resolution, which I don't think too many people would be buying these GPUs for, although there's definitely some competitive gamers out there who are. If we move up to 1440p max settings, which again does include a little bit of ray traced reflections, we're now seeing a 5% lead for the 4070 Ti Super at 136 versus 129, both doing really well here. I think you'd be happy with the performance. The 1% lows are a bit more separation with a 9% advantage for the Super at 123 versus 113. What if you move up to 4K resolution? At 4K resolution, we're actually seeing it now basically a tie, although small advantage to the AMD 7900 XT. 4% lead at 83 versus 80. 1% low is exactly tied at 73. I was curious about this. I think to me, the biggest thing is I do think you get more memory bandwidth on the 7900 XT, which could be paying off here at the higher resolution. Now, I was also curious what happens if you turn ray tracing off in this game. If you go down to the prioritize graphics preset, it reins in VRAM usage and it also turns off ray tracing. Here we're actually seeing the 7900 XT take an 8% advantage in the averages and a 9% advantage in the 1% lows. Although again, both GPUs are providing a very good experience here, 95 versus 103 80, in the averages, and the 1% lows even are 85 versus 93. But let's move on to some other games. Baldur's Gate 3 is very CPU limited in the demanding Act 3. Even here with 1440p resolution, 1080p saw basically the same results because it was CPU limited. Even at 1440p resolution here, we're pretty CPU limited. So we're seeing basically a tie in the averages, although a 9% advantage in the 1% lows for AMD, which can be related sometimes to CPU limited situations where you get less driver overhead. If we move up to 4K resolution, we're seeing 88 FPS versus 81, and we're now GPU limited. So we're seeing that the 7900 XT can stretch its legs and provide a 9% performance advantage in the averages and a 6% advantage in the 1% lows at 52 versus 49. So really in this game, the limiting factor is likely going to be the CPU once you get to Act 3 for most people. Once we hit, well, let's move over to Starfield. At 1080p ultra settings, we're seeing the 7900 XT taking an 11% lead in the averages at 107 versus 96. Both of those are very good, but we're seeing a larger 29% lead in the 1% lows, 75 versus 58, which is much more noticeable. And you do get a bit of a smoother frame time graph. We saw a couple of more spikes on the 4070 Ti Super. But I think most people would be buying these for 1440p or 4K. So at 1440p Ultra, we're seeing very good frame rates, 88 versus 79, which is an 11% advantage to the 7900 XT. Again, I think both of them doing very well, although the 1% lows are a much more noticeable advantage for the 7900 XT. Again, here at 69, nice, versus 58. So again, a better 1% lows on the 7900 XT. Now, both were already achieving good frame rates, but you could kick on quality level upscaling, which does now give the 7900 XT 102 FPS versus 95, which is 7% advantage for AMD here. And the 1% lows are 67 versus 63, so that's dropping to a 6% advantage for the 7900 XT. The game, I would say image quality advantage in the fine details is still advantage DLSS, and you could kick on frame generation as well. If we move on to 4K Ultra settings, we're now seeing 58 FPS for the 7900 XT, beating the 53 on the Super by 9%. The 1% lows are once again showing a more noticeable advantage at 49 versus 41, so a 20% advantage in the 1% lows. Now, both of these are very, very playable at these frame rates, but personally in a first-person shooter-style game, I would be looking for better, and one way to get there is enabling quality level upscaling, which looks good on both FSR and DLSS, but I do think DLSS looks a bit sharper and more stable in the small details, although again at 4K both look, I think, quite acceptable. We got 77 versus 72 FPS in the averages, 7% lead for the 7900 XT, and a 16% lead in the 1% lows, again a bit more noticeable there. Now let's move on to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3, 1080p basic settings. Honestly, at this point, performance is good enough on both GPUs that if you're losing, it's a skill issue. We're getting 347 average on the AMD GPU and 327 for NVIDIA. It's a 6% advantage in the averages for AMD, but a 10% advantage in the 1% lows for the Super from NVIDIA at 227 versus 207. But again, I'd call it basically a tie. Let's go ahead and move to 1440p resolution. So 1440p basic settings, we're seeing 283 average for the AMD GPU and 255 for the NVIDIA Super, which is an 11% advantage for AMD there. And now 1% lows advantage goes to AMD, and by a more noticeable 17% at 195 versus 167. That's a little bit more meaningful of a difference there, especially in a competitive game. The 1% lows can be pretty important. At 4K resolution, AMD's lead extends to 13% in the averages at 179 versus 158, and 23% in the 1% lows at 118 versus 96. Again, both GPUs are certainly giving you a good experience here, but it is a noticeable win now for the 7900 XT. It seems like as the resolution increases, the lead increases. Let's do some Unreal Engine 5 testing. We'll start out with RoboCop Rogue City at 1080p epic settings, and I did also turn on the higher detailed reflections. We're seeing 116 versus 112 average, so 4% lead for the 7900 XT. The 1% lows are 89 versus 88, so 1% lead for the 7900 XT. In other words, they're basically tied at 1080p epic, both delivering a very good high refresh rate experience. What about 1440p resolution? Well, I think I would also summarize it as they're basically tied and both delivering a very good experience. Although now frame rate numbers are 81 versus 79, so it is a 3% advantage for the 7900 XT. The 1% lows are exactly tied at 67, and a lot of people would be perfectly happy to play at these settings, native resolution. However, in a first-person shooter, a lot of people will be chasing higher frame rates, and Unreal Engine 5 does respond extremely well to upscaling. If you kick on the quality level upscaling, frame rate numbers now bump to 115 versus 110, so 5% advantage AMD. The 1% lows are 89 versus 84, so 6% advantage. But if you look at the image quality, the FSR image quality in this game is not good. The car grill right now is very shimmery. The grading in the background on the stores is very shimmery. The street is very shimmery in motion. But anyway, what about 4K resolution? At 4K epic settings, we're now seeing the Super take the lead, but again, it's basically a tie. We're seeing a 2 FPS advantage at 43 versus 41, so 5% lead. The 1% lows are 37 versus 36, so 1 FPS advantage, which is a 3% advantage. So basically, not a lot in it there, and those also probably aren't the settings you would use. Again, Unreal Engine 5 does respond well to upscaling performance-wise, bumping quality level upscaling, bumping us up to 68 versus 67, so it was still basically a tie in performance. 1% lows are still basically tied at 57 versus 56, technically 2% lead for the NVIDIA card. But image quality-wise, even at 4K resolution, the AMD image is looking a lot less stable in those fine details on the street, the car grills, the fencing, all that kind of stuff. And let's move on to Lords of the Fallen. At 1080p Ultra, we're seeing an 11% advantage for the 4070 Ti Super at 84 versus 76. We're also seeing overall lower frame rate numbers. This is the most demanding Unreal Engine 5 game I've tested. Also, in all of my testing in other GPUs, this has been a bit more of an NVIDIA-sided title. It's a 17% advantage in the 1% lows at 60 versus 51, although keep in mind those 1% lows are mostly traversal stutter as you round that corner into the new area. Moving up to 1440p resolution, we're seeing the 7900 XT actually falls below 60 FPS at 56, although the 4070 Ti Super is only hitting 62 FPS. It is an 11% lead, but you know it's not a mind-blowing difference here. The 1% lows are 15% advantage though at 45 versus 39. Again, I think the traversal stutter from Unreal Engine has a lot to play into that. Again, Unreal Engine 5 does respond very well to upscaling, and FSR here is looking better than it did in RoboCop, although I still think as the character model uncovers objects, they look a bit less stable underneath. And some other fine detail things. It's now a 15% advantage for the Super at 93 versus 81, and a 28% advantage in the 1% lows at 64 versus 50. So while I do think that is traversal stutter related, it does seem to be consistently higher in the 1% lows for the NVIDIA GPU here. If we move up to 4K Ultra settings, both GPUs are struggling at 35 and 32 FPS average respectively. So only a 3 FPS difference. At this low of resolution, that is frame rate number, that is a 9% advantage for the 4070 Ti Super, and a 12% advantage in the 1% lows at, again, 3 FPS difference, 29 versus 26. The point is, you probably wouldn't play the game at Ultra settings without upscaling. So if we turn on quality level upscaling, we're now hitting 61 average on the 4070 Ti Super, which gives it a 17% lead over the 52 frames per second on AMD's 7900 XT. The 1% lows are a 24% advantage at 47 versus 38. Now, we could go ahead and move on to one other Unreal Engine 5 game. So the last Unreal Engine 5 game we'll look at is Immortals of Aveum. I think this one's less popular, but it is another game that features FSR 3 frame generation. And it does use the full Unreal Engine 5 feature set and all that. So we'll take a look at it here. Without any upscaling at 1080p Ultra, we're seeing the GPUs fairly close with 108 versus 105 average, 3% advantage 7900 XT, slightly more noticeable 7% lead in the 1% lows. But let's move on to 1440p resolution. At 1440p Ultra, again, we're getting fairly similar results, although AMD is edging out the 4070 Ti Super at 80 versus 77 average, which is a 4% lead in the averages. The 1% lows are 63 versus 59, 7% advantage here. So we're definitely seeing a small win for the 7900 XT, but again, it's pretty similar results. And both numbers are high enough here that I don't think we have to kick on upscaling, but since we have FSR 3 and DLSS 3 in this game, I think at this point it's the only game with both, or at least it was at the time of testing. I thought that'd be interesting. My relative performance numbers are showing just the upscaling without the frame generation, where performance is very similar at 109 versus 108, but 7% lead in the 1% lows for AMD. The frame generation works very differently here. We're getting higher frame rate numbers from FSR 3, but lower 1% lows, and I'm not even sure they report correctly to the overlay. Let's move up to 4K Ultra, where now neither GPU is doing great. It's arguably playable, but I don't think you would choose to use these settings. It's 43 versus 40, so an 8% lead on the 7900 XT, and the 1% lows are 34 versus 32, giving a 6% advantage to the 7900 XT. But here I think you would want to enable quality level upscaling and or turn down settings. And if with the quality upscaling and no frame generation, we're seeing performance now 68 versus 67, giving a 2% advantage to the 4070 Ti Super, so it's basically a tie. 1% lows are a more noticeable advantage for AMD, but not a lot in it. More noticeable advantage by like 6%. Anyway, the frame generation, once again, I'm showing the results, but you really need to watch a more dedicated video on that topic. I think my biggest disappointment with the 4070 Ti Super upgrade is that it didn't push a larger jump in rasterized performance over its non-super predecessor to at least catch up to the 7900 XT. Now, granted, it's close, but the 7900 XT is usually faster in non-ray tracing situations. For example, if we kind of just scroll through these percentage differences in a lot of my non-RT testing, you'll see that it's not usually a massive lead, but it's often in the 5 to 10% range, sometimes less, sometimes more. And sure, the 4070 Ti Super does get a few wins as well. Games like Lords of the Fallen, which I have noticed does seem to be a bit more of an NVIDIA-sided title, especially when compared to my other Unreal Engine 5 testing and things like that. Sure, it does get some wins, and oftentimes I think one of the best ways to describe the non-ray tracing performance here is they're both delivering excellent results that you would be happy with, but the 7900 XT is doing better, right? So if you are just looking at raw rasterized performance, you have no interest in ray tracing or anything like that, then the 7900 XT costs less and delivers a bit more performance. Seems like the way to go, but the thing is, we're hitting a performance tier with ray tracing where I think it's actually a meaningful thing to discuss. For example, 1440. Now, I think this is actually interesting in that I think it's more of a 1440p argument, okay? Because this 4070 Ti Super is kind of hitting the magic performance tier now with the VRAM and memory bandwidth headroom that we don't have below this point in NVIDIA's product stack, where I think buying it for path tracing at 1440p is not actually a stupid thing to do. In NVIDIA's lower tier products, you have to use a lot of upscaling to reach good performance metrics in path tracing modes, in which case you're losing a lot of image quality to get there. However, the 4070 Ti Super is kind of hitting that magic like 1440p. Sure, you're upscaling, but at the quality setting, which looks pretty good at 1440p, especially when you have ray reconstruction in the mix. And so you're getting very good image quality, and you're getting path tracing. and you're getting good frame rates while you're doing it. You're averaging almost 60 FPS. Granted, in some areas of the game, you'll be a bit below. In some areas of the game, you'll be over it. But that's without frame generation, right? FG off, you're hitting around 60 FPS in 1440p path tracing and only at quality level upscaling. And that's kind of the magic number where, kicking on frame generation can start to make sense in single player titles and things like that. And you can see that 7900 XT just doesn't enable that same experience, right? So if you are someone who, the visual aspect of the latest AAA games, if playing path traced Alan Wake 2 is something that is interesting to you, then I think the 4070 Ti Super allows you to do that at acceptable image quality and performance, and the 7900 XT does not. Our other path tracing test we have out there right now is Cyberpunk, and with its 2.0 update and its new expansion pack, it's delivering a really good game that a lot of people I think would be interested in taking advantage of its fully path traced mode. And once again, granted, it's the built-in benchmark run, which is a bit less demanding than some areas, especially in the new Dogtown area of the Phantom Liberty update and all that. But 59 FPS average before you kick on frame generation, again, giving you a decent baseline for kicking on frame generation. By the way, with frame generation, I know some people are like, you should be testing the 7900 XT with like the FSR 3 mods, which I don't think is fair. I don't mod games in my direct reviews. We might do other separate videos on that. Or, how about the driver level frame generation? I will mention that is, as of the time of testing, still a preview driver feature. However, I believe the driver updates we're getting, I think as soon as possibly tomorrow, should actually have that built in as a major feature. However, my opinion on driver level frame generation is that without the direct integration into the game, it's of less quality. So I don't think it's directly comparable to DLSS 3 frame generation, but it has been exciting to see FSR 3 frame generation. Now that it's gone open source, the game adoption rate has increased dramatically. So I think that the frame generation difference here is still advantage NVIDIA overall with the full game integrated versions. But I think that the gap in the number of games and all that will be closing as we see AFMF. I mean, obviously you get AFMF in the driver level and like anything, but with FSR 3 adoption rates increasing. But that's not really my point of what I'm talking about here. This isn't about the frame generation, it's about the path tracing mode, right? So at 1440p quality upscaling with ray reconstruction helping out image quality and performance, again, you're hitting a decent baseline level here to get a good experience I think a lot of people would want to use, right? And so I think that is definitely a selling point for the 4070 Ti Super. Now, if you're planning on playing at 4K resolution though, I think we're starting to lose that selling point, and I think that's important to distinguish. If you're on a 4K screen, I think a lot of people would be okay going down as low as performance mode upscaling. I don't think many people would go beyond that to ultra performance mode, and even going all the way down to performance mode upscaling, we're hitting playable frame rates on the 4070 Ti Super, but we're talking only in the mid 40s in the Cyberpunk benchmark, right? And if we look back at Alan Wake 2 at the 4K path tracing settings, where was that one? Again, performance mode upscaling, we're in the mid 40s. So if you're planning on buying these GPUs for a 4K screen, I think that the path tracing modes suddenly become not as relevant of a selling point. So that is something to think about. However, if you're planning on playing at 4K resolution, you are more likely to be needing upscaling either now or in the near future as games become more demanding. And then I think the image quality advantages for DLSS start to become, again, more of a selling point. Now, at 1440p resolution, if you're just interested in rasterized performance, you're often getting good enough performance that you really don't need to kick on upscaling, right? Here, we're around 80 FPS in RoboCop Rogue City, 1440p, max settings, Unreal Engine 5, all of that. Now, granted, Unreal Engine 5 responds really well to an upscale, and you do get a nice, healthy performance boost, but you might not need to. Although as time goes on, again, that might become more of a thing you'll need to do. So I guess it's interesting. So if you're considering these cards at 1440p, I think the big difference is, how interested in those heavy-duty single-player ray tracing titles are you? And at 4K resolution, you might want to think more about the upscaler. I guess Now what does it come down to? So which GPU would I rather have? Well, personally, I'm interested in a lot more of the single player heavy duty titles like Cyberpunk, path tracing mode, Alan Wake 2 path tracing mode. Those are certainly games I'm interested in and have played and am currently playing those games. So right, that's something I'm interested in. So for me, that's definitely a big selling point here. And again, the DLSS image quality advantage, where you can see, RoboCop is a particularly bad FSR example, but it's easier to see through YouTube compression. You can see the street's kind of shimmery, this car grill's kind of unstable, the grading here in the background's kind of unstable. You can see things like that. Again, when we're on the DLSS. So that was the native resolution. So now that we're on DLSS, watch for stability issues here in the street, in the fence grading right there. Again, the street looks a little bit unstable itself. This car grill looks a bit unstable. So then you can go back and compare it to the native resolution or the DLSS image. And you can see there's definitely some image quality advantages there, right? So that's my point. Anyway, so there's definitely some selling points here. The point is that the AMD GPU should cost less than the NVIDIA GPU. So now we need to get into what actually makes sense. So, I don't love the 4070 Ti Super at $800, to be honest, but that is what it is, and it is improving NVIDIA's offering at this same price point. It's getting a little closer to the 7900 XT in rasterized performance. I would have loved to see it match it blow for blow in rasterized and then pull ahead in ray tracing, but that just isn't what we got. I think that's a bit of a disappointment. However, where do I want to see the pricing gap? I honestly think, how should I put this? If you get around a 20%, a 20% price cut for the competing AMD GPU, it becomes really hard to ignore, right? Which would be around like a 650 type price point, maybe 675, 660, somewhere in there. So I think if the AMD GPU went that low, I would just have to be like, man, you gotta really wanna do path tracing to have any reason to spend the extra money on the NVIDIA GPU. But that's not where we're at. Again, MSRP-wise, which is kind of irrelevant on the actual market, the 4070 Ti Super is technically less expensive. But again, MSRPs haven't been a real thing in a long time on the 7900 XT. So rumors are that AMD is targeting like the $750 price point. And I just don't think that's enough, right? Because at $750, you're only spending 7% more money to get a very similar, if slightly slower, rasterized experience, but you're enabling ray tracing experiences that are just not available on the AMD hardware, along with a better upscaler and a more widely implemented, game-integrated frame generator. There's other things about NVIDIA and the productivity workspace where that can be helpful, things like that. Now, on the current lowest pricing today, we have the 7900 XT at $720. Again, if I check pricing right now on the absolute lowest model. Although to be clear, the models as tested in this video was $750. Now, if we go down to the $720 price point that I'm seeing today, again, you have to spend 10% more money to get the NVIDIA GPU. At this kind of pricing tier, though, I don't think people are as extremely value conscious, right? If you're spending $700 to $800 on a graphics card, I think a lot of time you're looking for that kind of premium experience. And the NVIDIA GPU is offering, like I said, playable path tracing experiences once you hit this performance tier. And so I think for some people, that's going to be pretty hard to ignore. I would like AMD at a bare minimum to hit $699 here. Because at least if you're getting close to that 14 or 15% price cut, I think it's a bit more meaningful and will make people think. And like I said, I think if you got as low as $650, it would have my outright recommendation. Other than just be like, if you want path tracing, you're gonna pay a significant premium for it. Now, the other thing to consider with the 7900 XT pricing is that the lower it goes, the closer it gets against the 4070 Super, non-TI Super, right? The non-TI Super is a $599.99 MSRP, so $600 MSRP, and the 7900 XT, I've already done this comparison, can beat it in the lighter ray tracing titles like Avatar, although it still falls behind in the heavy like path tracing workloads. But those heavy path tracing workloads are less usable on the non-TI Super, so that becomes an interesting comparison. But Again, right now, it's a lot more expensive to go with the 7900 XT. And so I guess what I'm getting at is that the 7900 XT is kind of in a weird place between the 4070 non-Ti Super and the 4070 Ti Super, where there's that $200 price gap. And AMD is going to have to try to thread the needle with the 7900 XT. I do think it's a better graphics card than the non-Ti Super. But again, it has some of those disadvantages in the feature set. So, I don't think it can ask for a large price premium, although here you're getting 12 gigabytes of VRAM versus 20, and that's a pretty noticeable thing, right? So I think it justifies costing more than a 4070 non-Ti Super. But then, then we have to think about where does it fall versus the Ti Super, where I think it definitely needs to be priced less, despite a small rasterized performance lead. So like I said, I think at $650, it becomes my recommendation above to spend the extra $50 above the 4070 non-Ti Super, and it would also get a big value proposition against the $800 Ti Super. And so I think this would be kind of like, it would just be my flat out recommendation in the $600 to $800 price point. I'd just be like, man, the best value's on that 7900 XT. But that just isn't where it currently is. And in the 720 to 750 range, I think it's harder to justify the loss to the feature set and things like that. I'm really curious what you guys think in the comment section. I think I've been rambling on long enough, but a huge thank you to viewers, subscribers, and especially channel members who've clicked the join button to directly support the channel financially. These extremely long comparison videos, I mean, all of the GPUs I'm testing at this variety of settings and everything like this takes a massive amount of my time, and I get less sleep than I probably should, but powering through it, knowing that you guys value this, seeing all of these settings with the upscaling and frame generation on and off, and ray tracing and path tracing and the newest titles and all of that, it's really nice to know that you guys are valuing that, and I know not everybody is in a financial place to hit the join button and directly support, so that is totally okay. But huge thank you to those who have, and just viewers and subscribers and all of that. Huge thanks, and I hope everyone has an excellent day.